Welcome to a series where we talk about the World Cup histories of each nation at the 2026 World Cup. Today we'll be talking about by far the most unlikely World Cup winners ever. Uruguay is a tiny nation in South America who has consistently punched above their weight across like 4 or 5 different generations since the World Cup began. Strap in, we've got a big one here, let's waste no more time. We start early where Uruguay did a lot of their historic damage at the tournament. The nation has always been tiny, but since the very beginning, they've pretty much always punched above their weight. They were 2-time Olympic champions coming into the inaugural World Cup, and as such, they would be considered both the favorites coming into the World Cup, but would also be given sole hosting rights for what will almost certainly be the only time ever. In their home World Cup, Uruguay 1930, the hosts would begin in a group with fellow South Americans Peru as well as Romania. The Peru game was nervy, but they won thanks to a goal from an amputee, the one-armed Hector Castro. After putting 4 past Romania, La Celeste was on to the semifinals just like that. In the semis, Uruguay would play against Yugoslavia in front of nearly 80,000 home fans, and Yugoslavia immediately took a 1-0 lead. Almost led 2-0 if not for a disallowed goal, and then gave up 6 goals. Yugoslavia was not happy about the refereeing in this game to the extent that they refused to even play a third-place match against the US out of protest, but Uruguay was on to the first World Cup final to play against their neighbors and rivals Argentina. In this final, Uruguay would take an early lead on a goal from Pablo Dorado, but Argentina would hit back with 2 goals before halftime to take the lead. This has to be one of the most hype World Cup finals in the history of the tournament because Uruguay would hit back with an equalizer from Pedro Sella, then took the lead through Santos Idiate in the 68th minute. A goal from Hector Moreno, the one-armed hero, capped off a 4-2 win for La Celeste over La Albiceleste. Uruguay lifted the World Cup trophy for the first time before anyone else, and they'll always have that. Of course, the possibility of replicating such a feat was unlikely. What made it even more unlikely was that Uruguay would not go to either Italy 1934 or France 1938. In the case of 34, Uruguay was simply being petty. None of the European teams wanted to go to Uruguay in 1930, and only 4 of them actually did, so Uruguay returned the favor and declined to defend their title and be part of Benito Mussolini's nonsense. They also wouldn't go to France for 1938 in solidarity with the rest of Spanish-speaking Latin America over FIFA's choice to put the World Cup in Europe for the second time in a row, with World War II wiping out the next 2 planned World Cups in 1942 and 1946. This meant that Uruguay had to wait an unfathomable 20 years before getting a chance to defend their World Cup title. For Brazil 1950, Ecuador and Peru would withdraw and give Uruguay free passage to their first World Cup as visitors. Here, very interestingly, Uruguay would be drawn into a group with France, Bolivia, and Scotland was supposed to be here too, but their FA was being weird, so they didn't come. France would also withdraw from this group before the start of the tournament, leaving this as the only 2-team group in the history of the World Cup. It's essentially a playoff, and Uruguay would batter Bolivia 8-0 to make it to the next group stage, the real World Cup. It's the final 4 teams of Brazil 1950, and Uruguay arriving into this group after beating the shit out of Bolivia kind of felt like SpongeBob showing up, like coming fresh out of Weenie Hut Juniors. We have a Spain team that got here ahead of England, the best team of the Franco regime. We have Sweden, who similar beat Italy to get here and are no slouch. And none of them even compare to the hosts Brazil, a team with the best players in the world that are playing at home. This group is really just a victory lap. It's a parade for the Brazilians. Game 1 in this group was in Sao Paulo against Spain, and while Alcides Gigia did give Uruguay a pretty early lead, it was undone by a 3-minute brace posted by a Stanislav Basoda that gave Spain the 2-1 halftime lead. It would hold this lead for most of the second half before La Celeste found an equalizer via their captain, leader, and defensive juggernaut, Obdulio Varela. This game would end 2-2, and that kept Uruguay in the race, but with Brazil beating the absolute shit out of Sweden in the other game, the ante has been set. Uruguay has to be perfect from here on. In Game 2, once again in Sao Paulo against Sweden this time, Uruguay got off to the worst start possible when a dude named Karl-Erik Palmer scored on them in the 5th minute. Gigia would find another equalizer in this game, but the Swedes immediately got the lead back a minute later from Stig Sundqvist, and just like Spain, held a 2-1 lead against Uruguay at halftime. La Celeste once again had a comeback in them, although this time it was enough to win. They left it late, but Oscar Miguez got a brace and gave Uruguay the win in the 85th minute, knocking out both Spain and Sweden from the race. Everything was going to come down to the final group game between Brazil and Uruguay, and this World Cup technically has no final thanks to the weird no knockouts format. This Uruguay-Brazil matchup is basically the final, of course, but the rub on this game is that thanks to the way the table shook out coming into the match, Uruguay needed to straight up win this game while mighty Brazil could get away with a draw and they wouldn't have to play any kind of extra time or any nonsense, they would just get the trophy. This game was played at the Maracanã and no one at the time gave Uruguay a chance despite the nation's pre-World War II greatness. This was of course going to be one last victory lap for the Brazilians before they would lift the trophy for the first time. Of course, nobody told the Uruguayans that. Julio Varela would rouse the team before the game to take it to Brazil, and they did exactly that. Game got to halftime 0-0, and that's already better than some had predicted they would do, but Friasa would score a controversial goal just a few minutes after the restart, and that really should have been it. Brazil wins. Varela would argue it was offsides until he was blue in the face, but the game went on from here, and everyone watching had to just assume Uruguay was cooked. It's here though where Uruguay would actually take over the game. After finally putting some pressure on the Brazilian defense, Juan Chifino would find a 66-minute equalizer to undo the damage and leave it all to play for. With both teams in search of a winner, especially Uruguay, Alcides Giglia would score one of the famous goals that I was just unable to find any footage of. In the 79th minute, he would hit a low shot past Moacir Barbosa and silence the Maracanã. Goddamn, I wish there was footage of this. I can't imagine how bad the vibes there were. Brazil had no counterpunch. The game would end 2-1, and Uruguay would etch their name into football history forever with this result. It's one of the most famous upsets in the history of sports, a game nicknamed the Maracanã So. We've already talked about what this result did for Brazil. Check out the video I made on the history of Brazil for more on that, but it can best be described by this quote from Giglia. There are only 3 people that managed to silence the Maracanã: Frank Sinatra, the Pope, and me. That is a badass quote, and it captures not only how shocking this loss was for Brazil, but also how monumental it was for Uruguay. They won in 1930, of course, but that doesn't hold a candle to this triumph. It cemented Uruguay's place in the lore of the World Cup as the scrappy underdogs of the competition, lacking in population and resources, but making up for it with skill and determination. It's some anime shit, but that's the type of run this was. From now on, Uruguay fans would treat the World Cup like it's their birthright, giving them some pretty high expectations for the team moving forward. We move on to Switzerland 1954, where the Uruguayans would be there to defend their crown this time. They were one of the seeded teams along with Austria in Group 3, and thus they wouldn't play each other due to this strange World Cup format. Instead, they would both play each of Scotland and Czechoslovakia. Uruguay's first game was in Bern against the Central Europeans, and it remained scoreless for most of the game, but late goals from both Miguez and Chifino gave La Celeste the 2-0 win, and they got them a huge leg up going into their game against Scotland. I would say Game 2 against Scotland was pretty decisive. Carlos Borges got a hat trick, both Julio Abadi and Oscar Miguez got braces, and all 3 of those are Spanish-sounding names, all 3 Uruguayan, you guessed it, so yep, that does mean Scotland got clapped to the scoreline of 7-0. Uruguay was on to the knockouts where they would match up with the eternal rival of the Scots, and they would play their first World Cup match against England. This game was a scoring fest with Borges, Chifino, and Obdulio Varela, who is still here, all scoring along with Javier Ambroise to beat 3 Lions 4-2. This moved Uruguay into the semifinals again, where they would run into the new superpower of the world, the magnificent Magyars of Hungary. This is one of the best teams in the history of the sport, led by guys like Sandor Kocsis, one of the best attacking players in the world, Gyula Grosicz, one of the best goalkeepers in the history of the sport, and defensive midfielder Josip Bosek, the captain and heartbeat of the team. The Hungarians had talent all over the pitch, but they also had the best player in the world at the time, the amazing Ferenc Puskás. Unfortunately for Hungary, they were missing Puskás due to injury, but fortunately for them, they still had enough horsepower to match Uruguay's grit and hustle. This was the best game of that World Cup, unfolding like a 3-act play. Hungary took an early lead through one of their star attackers, Zoltán Csibor, and made it 2-0 right after halftime through a goal from Nándor Hedekudi. It looked so over for Uruguay, but they would get a goal back in the 75th minute through Juan Hoberg, and in the 86th minute, that guy got a brace, just very random. Uruguay were all the way back again, like they were some unkillable cockroaches. The game went to extra time from here, and clearly Uruguay spent all their energy because Hungary would win the game late with 2 goals from Kocsis. This is tough. It's Uruguay's first ever loss in the World Cup, and it makes this the first World Cup Uruguay attended and didn't win. It kind of shattered the illusion that Uruguay was this invincible team that will always find a way to come out on top. but it also took a literal superpower to do it, and the game was still close. Uruguay would get their game against Austria after all in the third place game, and they lost their second straight World Cup game 3-1 to finish fourth place in Switzerland. Still a good result, although I'm sure their fans didn't want to hear it at the time. Now we get to Sweden 1958 qualifying, and it was Jover for this Uruguayan team. In a group with Colombia and Paraguay, they gave Colombia the only point they'd get in a draw to open the group, and a stunning 5-0 loss to Paraguay ended things. Uruguay would finish 1 point behind La Albirroja and failed to qualify to the World Cup for the very first time. Chile 1962 made it much easier to qualify out of South America, with 3 spots up for grabs in addition to Chile and Brazil qualifying automatically. Uruguay just had to beat Bolivia to make it, and granted this was a Bolivia team that would win the Copa America in 1963 for the only time in their history. But Uruguay would still manage to qualify with a 1-1 draw in the first leg and a narrow 2-1 win at home. In Chile, La Celeste would be drawn in a group with fellow South Americans Colombia, as well as the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, both out of Eastern Europe. Uruguay's first game in the desert city of Arica was against Colombia, and for some reason Uruguay were right in this game? I'm extremely confused. Anyway, Colombia took the lead on an early penalty and looked on their way to their first ever World Cup win, but this is Uruguay we're talking about. These guys are kings of the sport. They would come from behind to win 2-1 and get off to a winning start. In Game 2 against Yugoslavia, the opposite would happen. Uruguay would take the lead in the 19th minute on a goal from Angel Cabrera, but Yugoslavia would have the lead by the half-hour mark and would win 3-1 to do a big dent to Uruguay's knockout hopes. This put everything on their final game against the Soviet Union, and tied at 1-1 late, Uruguay had a chance to win the game and sneak through to the knockouts again, but instead Valentin Ivanov scored in the 89th minute to win it for the Russians and group Uruguay for the first time ever. England 1966 qualifying saw Uruguay drawn with Peru and Venezuela, and this was no issue for the 2-time World Cup champs. Both wins over Venezuela were decisive, both wins over Peru were tight, but Uruguay finished with 8 points of 8 and easily qualified to the World Cup again. In the British Isles, Uruguay would be drawn with the hosts as well as France and Mexico. This was 3/4 of the 2010 group we're going to get to soon, with just the hosts swapped out for each other. And just like in that 2010 group, Uruguay opened this with a 0-0 draw at Wembley against the English. Game 2 was a 2-1 comeback win over France that saw all 3 goals scored in the first half, and this put Uruguay in a great spot. They couldn't beat Mexico. This game actually finished 0-0, but this was still enough for Uruguay to finish in second behind the hosts and move on to the knockouts. In the quarterfinals, Uruguay was matched up with 1954 winners West Germany, and they just got the shit beaten out of them. Helmut Haller scored in the 11th minute to put the Germans in the lead, and Uruguay fell apart from here. 2 red cards for Uruguayan players early in the second half doomed La Celeste to a blowout loss, with West Germany eventually winning 4-0 to move on and eliminate Uruguay. Mexico 1970 put Uruguay in a qualifying group with Chile and Ecuador, and this was similarly painless for La Celeste. A 0-0 draw in Santiago and 3 wins meant that Uruguay were through to the World Cup again. In the land of the sun, Uruguay would be drawn in a group with Italy, Sweden, and Israel. Game 1 in Puebla was a 2-0 win over Israel, a good result for sure, always take winning the first game of the World Cup. And when combined with a 0-0 draw against Italy in Game 2, Uruguay was kind of cooking here. Even a late loss to Sweden in Game 3 wasn't enough to sink them out of a top 2 spot, with Uruguay still edging out Sweden on goal difference. Uruguay met the Soviet Union in the quarterfinals, and this one was 0-0 all the way through regular time, damn near all the way through extra time as well, but substitute Victor Espartago would find the winner in the 117th minute to get revenge on the Soviets and reach the semifinals for the first time since 1954. Here they would run into the death machine that was the 1970 Brazilian team. Luis Cabilla opened the scoring for Uruguay, but Brazil would have their revenge for 1950 to the tune of a Clodoaldo equalizer, a Jairzinho 76-minute goal to take the lead, and a Rivellino 89th-minute goal to seal the game for the Seleção. A 1-0 loss to West Germany in the bronze medal match led to another 4th-place finish here. Uruguayan fans surely hoped their run in 1970 was a sign they'd always be around as dark horses and championship contenders, but we're about to undergo a pretty significant dark age for Uruguayan football. Qualifying for West Germany in 1974 was rough, with them in a group with Colombia and Ecuador and just barely escaping. Uruguay would draw and lose with Colombia, and only sweeping Ecuador and seeing Colombia draw twice with La Tri got Uruguay through on goal difference. In West Germany, the Uruguayans were drawn with 3 European sides, meaning Sweden, Bulgaria, and the Netherlands. They would open the tournament against the Dutch, and this was a passing of the torch. The Dutch are also a small nation that constantly punch above their weight in soccer, and this was their World Cup to put themselves on the map. Total football was about to take the football world by storm, and Uruguay was their first victim. 2-0 the final, 2 goals from Johnny Rep, and Uruguay was in a race to the bottom. They rescued a late draw against Bulgaria with an 87th minute goal from Ricardo Pavoni, and then they lost their last game 3-0 to Sweden to finish at the bottom of the group with just 1 point. Qualifying for Argentina in 1978 was surprisingly restrictive for CONMEBOL nations, but Uruguay didn't mind because they were put in a group with Bolivia and Venezuela, 2 of the bottom feeders of the continent. Somehow Uruguay had got held to a draw in Caracas by La Vinotinto, then they lost in La Paz to the altitude merchants Bolivia. Uruguay would finish second place in this group and not make it to the World Cup despite how easy it would have been. For Spain in 1982, they would be drawn into a group with Peru and Colombia, and this was significantly harder for La Celeste this time because Peru was actually a good team. After beating Colombia at home with a late brace from Julio Morales, Uruguay would lose at home to Peru and then draw 0-0 in Lima to end their chances. Peru would win the group and go through, and Uruguay was out for the second straight World Cup, the first time they would ever fail to qualify for back-to-back World Cups. Qualifying for Mexico in 1986 saw Uruguay in a group with Chile and Ecuador, and this was once again rough sledding. Wins home and away against La Tri were huge, but a 2-0 loss in Santiago meant that they had to beat Chile in the home leg to end the group. Tied 1-1 going into the second half, Uruguay would win a penalty and Venancio Ramos would put it away to put La Celeste in the lead. They would hold this lead and confirm the win to pip Chile for the automatic ticket by 1 single point. For the first time since 1974, Uruguay was going back to the World Cup. The bad news is they would be drawn into a diabolical group for their World Cup return. Put in a group with West Germany, Scotland, and Denmark, nothing was going to be easy. Their hugely important first match against fellow 2-time World Cup champs West Germany, the South Americans got off to an amazing start when Antonio Alsamende robbed Lothar Matthäus and beat keeper Harald Schumacher 1-on-1, finishing by bar-downing into the empty net for a 4th-minute Uruguayan lead. The boys just needed to defend this lead and take the 2 points, and they would defend that lead for 80 minutes of game time, getting to literally the 84th minute with the lead despite overwhelming West German pressure. Klaus Allofs would finally get behind the defense and finish past backup Uruguayan keeper Fernando Alves, who had a great game in keeping the Germans out of goal for as long as he had. Still, Uruguay would take the draw here. It really opened up this group for them. Uruguay would carry some optimism going into their game against Denmark and Nesa, and that optimism was crushed into a fine paste. It was non-stop Danish pressure from the jump, with Preben Elkjær finishing off one of their first opportunities to put the Scandinavians in the lead in just the 11th minute. Things went from bad to worse when in the 19th minute Miguel Bosio would be booked for a vicious tackle, and that was already his second yellow card of the game. Already behind 1-0, Uruguay now had a man disadvantage and they had an uphill climb from there. The South Americans would hold out for the most of the first half, but near halftime a cross from Elkjær would catch the Uruguayan defense napping and found Søren Lerby for an easy finish at a 2-0 lead. They would win a penalty right before halftime and the great Enzo Francescoli would put it away to make it 2-1, but that was just a stay of execution. Michael Laudrup would score an amazing goal where he just ghosted past the defense and poked it near post past Alves to put Denmark up 3-1. Most normal teams would be content with the 3-1 lead and sit on it to lock up the 2 points, but the Danes just kept going. Elkjær scored a second goal in a shit show to make it 4-1, then on a counter he got wide open past the entire defense and ran down the pitch, juking Alves and finishing off his hat-trick to make it 5-1. The Danes weren't even done there. Jesper Olsen finished a nice goal a few minutes before the end of the game to make the final score 6-1. Just a complete undressing of the Uruguayans by Denmark. In my opinion, this is the game that fully killed the mistake of Uruguay at the World Cup. These guys had this aura of inevitability around them even going up to the 1970 World Cup, but now this is just another national team. Somehow Uruguay still had a chance to qualify going into their last game against Scotland, but they needed a result here. Their odds were seemingly shot to smithereens when Jose Batista earned Uruguay's second red card of the tournament and did so literally in the first minute of the game, becoming and remaining the fastest ever sending off at the World Cup. Down to a 10v11 for the rest of the game, Uruguay resorted to brutal tactics to try and shithouse a result. They brought down Gordon Strachan any chance they could, completely constricted the airflow of the game, and eventually did manage to get themselves a 0-0 draw that eliminated the Scots in 4th place. Uruguay did manage 3rd place in the group on the strength of this result, and since they finished in 4th place out of the 6 third placers, Uruguay would become the final team to move into the round of 16, but the way they did so was not glamorous. They were only even decent in one of their 3 games. Tactics against Scotland earned them an absolute lashing from Sir Alex Ferguson at his post-game presser, and yet they were moving on to the knockouts to play Diego Maradona and Argentina. Puebla, Mexico would see a World Cup rematch of the very first final in 1930, and La Albiceleste would dominate the chances early. Failing to put any of them away though, and approaching halftime still at 0-0. 3 guys not named Maradona would contribute to Argentina's opening goal though, with Jorge Burruchaga finding Jorge Valdano, who would absorb the pressure and find a wide-open Pedro Pasculi for the goal. Losing going into halftime, Uruguay did not come out with the urgency that the situation demanded. They would hold on for dear life and try to preserve the 1-0 deficit, and by the time they got around to attacking late in the game, rain had started coming down, and this made Uruguay's situation that much tougher. The final whistle would end the game at Argentina 1, Uruguay 0, and that's it for Uruguay's very disappointing 1986 adventure. For Italia 90, Uruguay would be drawn into a qualifying group with Peru and Bolivia, and they won in Lima but lost in La Paz, and that second result put them behind the 8 ball. Luckily, they would clean up their home games and tie Bolivia at the top of the standings, where Uruguay's superior goal difference would see them through as group winners to their second straight World Cup appearance. In Italy, the Uruguayans would get a tough draw again when they got Belgium and Spain, 2 tough European teams, as well as South Korea. They were looking at similar odds to 1986, and the start was familiar. Uruguay shithoused a 0-0 result against Spain, and a game where they were arguably the better side, and they'll take the result for sure, but it's also a little disappointing they weren't able to find a goal. Shifting to Verona for Game 2, Uruguay would get rocked by Belgium for 2 goals in the first half and a third one right after the restart, with all 3 goals being really nice ones. By the time Uruguay did anything in the game, they were already down 3-0, and while they would get one back through Pablo Bengochea, the game ended 3-1, and Uruguay was once again on 1 point after 2 games. They really needed a result, or preferably a win against South Korea in their final game. Going back to Udine, Uruguay would play out a dire game with South Korea that was 0-0 all the way until the end of the second half. The game was very physical, and for once the Uruguayans weren't the primary guilty party, with the Koreans doing a lot of fouling to break up Uruguay's offense and keep them from getting in any kind of a rhythm. On a stoppage time free kick, though, Alfonso Dominguez sent the ball in, and it found the head of Daniel Fonseca, who sent it past the Korean keeper for a last gasp winner. This was Uruguay's first win at the World Cup in 2 decades, which is insane, and it meant that for the second straight World Cup, Uruguay was third in the knockouts as the 16th team of 16, being the 4th best third place team of 6 and just barely scraping by. In the round of 16, Uruguay would match up with the hosts Italy, and once again La Celeste was simply outclassed. This was once again scoreless at halftime. Uruguay was competitive in this game, but Italia 90 hero Toto Schillaci scored in the 65th minute, and Aldo Serenas added a second to finish off a 2-0 win for the hosts. Uruguay was out in the round of 16 yet again. USA 94 qualifying saw Uruguay in a group with Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, with the top 2 advancing, and you'd think that's good news for Uruguay. Instead, Bolivia won their first 5 games of the group and threw a wrench into that. After 7 games of 8, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Brazil were in a 3-way tie where only 2 could go through. Having to play their last game at the Maracanã, though, Uruguay would lose 2-0 on a Romario brace, and Bolivia would pick up the 1 point they needed in Guayaquil to get the second spot and slam the door on Uruguay, kicking them out of the World Cup for the first time since 1982. France 1998 saw the expansion to 32 teams and the CONMEBOL expansion to the Mega Double Round Robin. With Brazil qualified automatically as the holders, yes, they really won the World Cup after having to fight for their lives against Uruguay at the Maracanã. Besides Brazil, the top 4 qualified out of the other 9 teams. Halfway through the double round robin, Uruguay sat in 6th place, outside of the automatic spots and even behind Bolivia on goal difference. Their results after this were just not good enough, taking losses in Asuncion and La Paz, and sitting literally 8th place with 4 games to go, only ahead of Venezuela. A win against Chile helped, but after losing 2-1 in Lima, it was over. A 0-0 draw in Buenos Aires in their penultimate game confirmed Uruguay's fate, and they would finish 7th place in the final group table. No World Cup for Uruguay again. Going into the 21st century, Uruguay's luster and mystique was gone. No one cared anymore. Sure, they had a young phenom named Diego Forlan lighting up the Brazilian league, and he would soon sign for Manchester United, but this team had won just a single World Cup game in 3 decades. They needed to change that, and that journey would begin with qualifying for Korea-Japan 2002. Halfway through the double round robin this time, Uruguay sat in 5th place, which was the Intercontinental playoff spot. They continued to pick up inconsistent results after this, doing stuff like beating Brazil at home and then losing in Maracaibo to the Venezuelans. The Uruguayans more or less held down the 5th place Intercontinental playoff spot all the way into the final match day, where they got a draw with Argentina at home, and that was barely enough to hang on to that 5th place spot ahead of Colombia. La Celeste was going to a playoff with Australia out of Oceania, with the winner going to East Asia. I covered this playoff in more detail in my Australia video, watch that one if you haven't yet, but Uruguay would lose 1-0 in the first leg in Melbourne to leave everything in the second game, the return leg in Montevideo. The South Americans were not kind hosts to the Aussies, abusing them off and on the pitch and winning 3-0 to break Aussie hearts and book their first trip to the World Cup since Italian 90. This is great and all, but Uruguay's group draw was not so pleasant. They got the defending champions France, a dangerous Denmark team, and then debutant Senegal, who weren't supposed to do anything. Their first game against Denmark was for everything, with the winner being the favorites to grab the other spot alongside France. That is, until France lost their opener to Senegal in one of the greatest World Cup upsets of all time. We'll talk about it twice very soon. But that really opened up this group before this second game kicked off in Ulsan. This one was even, with both teams having chances in the first half, but Jon Dahl Tomasson would give the Danes the lead right before halftime. On the other side of the break though, Dario Rodriguez would hit a fucking banger of a goal to even things up. Uruguay would hold out from here, and they fully committed to defending the point late when they subbed off their best attacking player, Alvaro Recoba. Right after that happened, Tomasson found the winner with a bar-down header. Denmark would take the 3 points and put Uruguay in a lot of danger going into their match with the holders. La Celeste and Les Bleus were both desperate for all 3 points in Busan, and this game was borderline unwatchable. France was already without Zinedine Zidane, and then Thierry Henry was sent off with a straight red, and now Uruguay actually had the man advantage for once. This was crazy, but they weren't able to put any of their opportunities away, and the game would finish 0-0, with Uruguay now on 1 point and needing to beat Senegal in their last game to get through. This game in Suwon was absolutely insane. The 2-time champs would get played off the pitch in the first half by a debuting nation out of West Africa. Senegal's danger man El Hadji Diouf would win a penalty in the 19th minute of the game, one that Kalilou Fadiga would put away to put the Lions of Teranga in the lead. Soon after, Papa Bouba Diop would score not 1 but 2 bangers to give Senegal a 3-0 lead. This is insane. Uruguay was completely no-showing. Then Victor Pua made 2 subs and threw on both Diego Forlan and Richard Morales, and this changed everything. Morales immediately scored on one of his first touches to get La Celeste one back right at halftime, and the South Americans would continue to push forward from there. Forlan would score an amazing long shot in the 69th minute to bring it back to 3-2, and Senegal's defense was falling apart. You knew an equalizer was coming, and Morales would win one for Uruguay when he flopped in the box. This let Recoba step up and convert, bringing the game to an unthinkable 3-3 score. This was an amazing comeback, but in order to make it into the knockouts, they needed one more goal. Morales had one more opportunity to etch his name into the history books and cement his status as an Uruguayan football legend, but he missed the open header and the game finished 3-3. This was an awesome game, but Uruguay was grouped as a result of it. Germany 2006 qualifying started reasonably well, with 2 wins and a draw with Brazil out of their first 4 games, but then they had a horrible run of 3 games, losing 3-0 at home to Venezuela, 3-1 at home to Peru, and then 5-0 in Barranquilla to Colombia. They now sat in 9th place, and halfway through they would only rise to 8th place, ahead of Colombia and Bolivia by only 1 single point. Uruguay would go on a crazy unbeaten run from here, getting to matchday 15 without losing a single game, but also only beating Paraguay at home during this time. Uruguay still sat in 7th place, 2 points out of the playoff spot and 4 points out of an automatic ticket. A clutch 3-2 win over Colombia thanks to a hat-trick from Marcelo Salaeta, and another draw in Quito meant Uruguay had risen to 5th, sitting just a single point ahead of Chile and Colombia. With a huge 1-0 win at home against Argentina in their final matchday thanks to a goal from Recoba, Uruguay clinched their spot at the Intercontinental Playoffs and another shot at the World Cup once again against Australia. Just like with the other one, I covered this playoff in the Australia video, and this didn't go as well. A 1-0 win in Montevideo was good, but Mark Bresciano got Australia their goal back in Sydney. The playoff would go to extra time and eventually to penalties, where misses from Dario Rodriguez and Marcelo Salaeta sunk La Celeste. The Aussies got their revenge, and Uruguay was missing out on the World Cup again. We've now covered a 4-decade span where Uruguay gets 1 single win at the World Cup, and that's how Uruguay's reputation sink as time went on. There's hope though, because there's a new generation of great Uruguayan players coming. They would get a chance to prove this in South Africa 2010 qualifying, where things went very similar. They sat in and around the playoff spot for most of this campaign, but a 3-1 win at home against Colombia and a huge 2-1 win in Quito cemented their spot at least in the playoffs. They had a chance to win an automatic ticket and send Argentina to the playoffs instead, but a late goal from a dude named Mario Balati saw Lobby Celeste get the win instead and send Uruguay to the Intercontinental Playoffs for the third straight qualifying campaign. This time they were playing Costa Rica out of Central America, a similarly physical team. Diego Lugano would score the only goal of the game in Uruguay's road game in San Jose, giving them a huge edge coming home where they would hold on for the 1-1 draw and win the playoff 2-1 to make it back to the World Cup. Uruguay was occupying the same speculative dark horse status coming into South Africa that they always had at all of these previous World Cups, but when they were drawn into a group with France, Mexico, and the host South Africa, it was easy to see Uruguay as the afterthoughts of this group. Game 1 against France didn't really change anything. This game was really poor, with both teams looking super uninspired on attack and the game finishing 0-0. Most interesting that happened here was Nicolas Ladero being sent off late in the game, but Uruguay will take this point, let me be clear. This was a good result for them, but a terrible result for us as viewers because this game sucked. Game 2 in Cape Town against the host was really where Uruguay picked up their reputation as heels at the modern World Cup. I was fully on board the South Africa train, I'd fallen in love with the hosts, and they still had an outside shot at qualifying for the knockouts coming into this game. So, of course, Diego Forlan hit a cannon of a shot from outside the box to give La Celeste the lead and put them in a great position to advance instead. South Africa stayed in this game and tried to find their equalizer, but any chances of that evaporated late when their keeper took down Luis Suarez in the box. Not only did Forlan put away the penalty to make it 2-0, but the keeper was sent off for this, and Uruguay had effectively killed off the game. Suarez would create a third goal with a cross that Alvaro Pereira tapped in, and Uruguay would win the game 3-0 to all but confirm their spot at the knockouts and all but eliminate the hosts. Playing against Mexico and Rustenburg, Uruguay knew all they needed was a draw in this one, but despite seeming to relish in playing heels, even Uruguay wouldn't stoop so low as to play out a kick-around 0-0 draw a la West Germany and Austria in 1982. Both teams actually had a lot of opportunities, but shortly before halftime, Uruguay's two young strikers would link up. Edinson Cavani, the 23-year-old Palermo striker, would find Luis Suarez in the box. Suarez, the young 23-year-old playing for Ajax at the time, would head past Oscar Perez and put Uruguay in the lead. La Celeste would hold out through the entire second half and win the game 1-0. This was huge. It allowed Uruguay to win the group and not only reach the knockouts, but avoid Argentina and instead match up with South Korea in a very winnable round of 16 match. With the US or Ghana potentially winning in the quarterfinals, Uruguay suddenly had a very real path to the semis. Going to Caberca to play South Korea, Uruguay would start the game amazing, with Suarez scoring early and the team holding that lead until halftime. Midway through the second half, though, La Celeste would concede their first goal of the entire tournament on a really bad defensive miscue and a flap from Fernando Muslera in goal. The game was there for either team to take, but Suarez would strike again with an amazing curled shot from the edge of the box to put Uruguay in a lead that they would keep this time. La Celeste had won a knockout game for the first time since 1970, breaking a 4-decade-long curse. This got them to Soccer City for a date with destiny. Uruguay versus Ghana, one of the craziest games in the history of the World Cup. I can't believe I finally get to talk about this one. The context is that Ghana was the third ever African team to reach the quarterfinals, and having done so in the first ever African World Cup made them the darlings of the sport. Uruguay were a fascinating story up to this point, and whoever won this game would be the biggest underdogs of the semis, but Ghana was the neutrals' favorites in this one. This game was pretty good. The first half was even, but Ghana would find the lead in stoppage time on a bomb of a shot from Suleiman Tari. Diego Forlan would equalize with another banger of a goal on the other side of halftime, bringing the game to 1-1, where the goalies would take over. Muslera had a good game in goal for La Celeste, Richard Kingston actually looked serviceable for the Black Stars, and both would hold out through regular time. Let's get to the moment that everybody remembers, though. Late in extra time with the game heading towards penalties, Ghana would get one last good attack in. After a free kick sent into the box, Steven Appiah shot and Luis Suarez was Johnny on the spot blocking the shot. How novel, a striker saving their ass on defense in stoppage time, how cute. And Ghanaian substitute Dominic Adia was there for the rebound, and his shot was blocked once again by Suarez. I'll be a little bit more specific. Suarez stuck his arm up and blocked the shot from Adia with his arm. You aren't allowed to do that. The referee immediately pointed to the spot and sent the Ajax man straight off. Uruguay was dangling from the cliff. Asamoah Gyan stepped up to the spot with a chance to end the game and send Ghana through to the World Cup semis. He stepped up, shot, and hit the crossbar. Absolutely bad shit. Suarez is walking off the pitch and towards the locker room when Gyan misses, and you can see his entire mood change. He starts celebrating because his sacrifice was worth it. He stopped a certain goal and traded it for a probable goal and got lucky. This was an instinctual decision. It worked out, but it would result in Luis Suarez becoming the most unpopular soccer player on the planet and staying there for a good half-decade or so. What's crazy is this still only got us to a penalty shootout, where the first 2 takers for each team hit. A third hit for Uruguay was followed by a John Mensah pen being saved by Muslera. La Celeste took the lead and then promptly gave it away when Maxi Pereira sent his penalty to Mars. Dominic Adia had the chance for redemption after he should have had the winner, but his pen was poor and Muslera easily got to it, giving Uruguay the advantage again. Sebastian Abreu now had the chance to win it for Uruguay, and he did so with the cheekiest Panenka you'll ever see. Uruguay was through. They were officially the villains, but they don't care. Luis Suarez was a national hero. He claimed that the hand of God belonged to him now, and his team was on to the semifinals. La Celeste would play the Aranya in Cape Town with a spot in the World Cup final on the line, and they were without Luis Suarez for this one. This was the final punishment for the now new hand of God, and it meant Uruguay was digging in, or at least they were going to try to. Not much you can do when Giovanni Van Bronckhorst randomly just unloads from like 35 yards out and nails it top corner to put the Dutch ahead in the 18th minute. Really not much you can do. Luckily for Uruguay, Forlan had an answer before halftime, as he always seemed to in South Africa. This was probably his weakest goal of the tournament. It was still from outside the box, but Martin Stecklenburg really should have kept this one out of goal. Still, it was 1-1 going into the half. It was back to parking the bus for La Celeste, but the Dutch would retake the lead in the 70th minute on a controversial goal from Wesley Sneijder that could have been ruled out for an offsides by Robin van Persie in front of goal, but it was given and the Netherlands were ahead. Arjen Robben's bald head would put the Dutch up 3-1, and even despite a stoppage time goal from Maxi Pereira, it was over. Uruguay had a great run, their best run in so long, but they were done. The bronze medal match between Uruguay and Germany ended up being a banger. Thomas Muller opened the scoring early, but Suarez would set up Cavani for his first goal in the World Cup, and after halftime, Forlan would give Uruguay the lead with his 5th goal of the tournament and perhaps his best. The side volley on the edge of the box was sick as fuck. Diego Forlan was sick as fuck. He's the reason why I had a level of affinity for this Uruguay team despite everything else. Unfortunately for Uruguay, they would concede just a few minutes later when Muslera got caught flapping for the 2nd time in the tournament, letting Marcel Janssen equalize. Sami Khedira would get Germany ahead in the 82nd minute, scoring off a corner, but Uruguay did have one last chance to equalize with the final kick of regular time. Diego Forlan had a free kick in prime position. He stepped up, and he hit the crossbar with an awesome shot, but that was game. Uruguay would finish in 4th place, still a great run that put Uruguay back on the map. Coming off all that, Uruguay would attempt to run it back at the 2014 World Cup in neighboring Brazil. I feel like I'm going insane because Uruguay would once again have the exact same campaign, sitting in or around the playoff spot for the entire group once again. They would damn near grab an automatic spot, but lost the critical game in the penultimate match in Quito, losing 1-0 and finishing in 5th place on goal difference. This means for the 4th consecutive World Cup, Uruguay is going to the Intercontinental Playoffs. The reigning 4th players would be going against Jordan of all teams. We'll get into that very soon when we talk about Jordan, but Al Nashama stood no chance here. 5 different Uruguayans would get on the score sheet in the first leg in Amman, and a 0-0 home result later, Uruguay had done it the hard way once again, but they were going back to the World Cup as South America's 6th team. One thing Uruguay has become accustomed to in modern World Cups is getting crazy-ass group draws, with even 2002's ending up being a crazy one after the emergence of Senegal at that tournament. But Brazil 2014 cooked up the craziest one yet. Uruguay would be in a group with 2 fellow World Cup winning nations, with both England and Italy out of Europe. They would also get Costa Rica out of Central America, the theoretical whipping boys of the group, and Uruguay's first opponent. Costa Rica was looking for revenge on La Celeste for keeping them out of South Africa, but let's be real, no one was expecting that to actually occur. This was Luis Suarez's first roadblock on his path to international glory, and nothing more. Uruguay would win a penalty in the first half, and Edinson Cavani put it away to put La Celeste in the lead, and it's smooth sailing from here. Except, Joel Campbell scored a great goal for Los Ticos to equalize early in the second half and hit Uruguay with the ball and shirt, fake pregnant, shucking my thumb celebration, which may just be on the Mount Rushmore of World Cup goal celebrations, along with the Bafana Bafana dance, the Aghawa backflips, and Griezmann doing a Fortnite dance in the World Cup final. Just a few minutes later, the Central Americans took the lead on a far post header from Oscar Duarte, and everyone rooting for Uruguay was shook now. This was insane, and they would finish it off late with a 3rd goal from Marco Ureña. Costa Rica won 3-1. Uruguay was almost certainly about to get grouped after losing their most winnable game. Going to Sao Paulo to play England, this one was pretty wild. Both teams were on 0 and needed to win bad, but Luis Suarez would strike first heading home across from Cavani before halftime. La Celeste would hold on for most of the game after this, but Wayne Rooney would find an equalizer on his only ever World Cup goal. With 1 point almost certainly dooming them, Uruguay needed to find a winner, and who else but Suarez would step up again. Aided by a lax English defense, he would fire home past Joe Hart to give La Celeste the winner after all. Suarez had just become a villain in a new country, but now everything was on Uruguay versus Italy in the final group game after the Azzurri became the second victim to the world-beating Costa Ricans. Italy versus Uruguay was an extremely tense game that I unfortunately don't really have the time to get into the nitty-gritty of. That's a shame because this is the only time I'll get to talk about it during this series. The game went to halftime 0-0 with both teams playing very conservatively, but everything broke when Claudio Marchisio was sent off with a straight red for Italy with 30 minutes to go. Uruguay would be the better team in the second half, but if they weren't rewarded for playing like it, Italy would go through in the case of a 0-0 draw. The stakes were clear. It was time for Luis Suarez to step up, and he did, biting Giorgio Chiellini on the shoulder like a fucking psychopath. I'm not kidding. This is the coldest shit anyone has ever done in the World Cup. This isn't even the first time Suarez had even bitten somebody on the pitch, but like, Jesus Christ, why? The best part is the refs didn't even see it, so while the Italian players were all screaming at the ref like we have a fucking vampire on the pitch right now, they would concede a corner and Uruguay, specifically Diego Godin, would score off of it. Cinema. Just insane. Uruguay would win the game 1-0. They were on to the knockouts for the second straight World Cup. Italy would be banished to the Shadow Realm because they literally haven't played a World Cup game since this, and Luis Suarez was once again the most hated soccer player on earth. Uruguay's reward for all this hard work was a date with Colombia in the round of 16, where their second great villain run was ended by one man. In the 28th minute, James Rodriguez would score one of the greatest World Cup goals ever to put Los Cafeteros in the lead, and they would stay there. A second goal from James just after halftime on a header unceremoniously put an end to Uruguay's run, and a surprisingly comfortable win in the 2014 round of 16 game, where literally everyone else in that round was biting off their fingernails for the entire game. Of course, part of the reason for this is that Luis Suarez was not playing in the game. This was the first game of a 9-game ban for Suarez for, biting somebody. So in this case, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. He fully deserved this. Trying to make it back to Russia 2018, qualifying finally went better for Uruguay. Things finally weren't a struggle. They actually sat in first place in the table after half of the double round robin, ahead of both Brazil and Argentina and everybody else as well. A poor run of form let Brazil run away with first place and brought La Celeste back to the hodgepodge of 2nd through 8th, but a big win in Asunción on match day 16 basically locked them in. After getting 4 points from bottom of the table Venezuela and Bolivia in their last 2 games, Uruguay finished second place in the table, and for the first time since literally 1990, Uruguay has qualified automatically to the World Cup. That's crazy. Things are finally different for Uruguay. They're dodging the Intercontinental playoffs, and look at this group draw. We're used to the toughest group draws possible, but in Russia, Uruguay would get the hosts, one of the weakest teams of the tournament, along with Egypt, who is just seen as Mo Salah and a bunch of dudes. And then Saudi Arabia, who is also just seen as a bunch of dudes. Uruguay would be the odds-on favorite to win this group and make it back to the knockouts again. Uruguay would begin their journey in Yekaterinburg against Egypt in a game where the Pharaohs were missing their best player, the great Mo Salah. The Egyptians would park the bus as a result, holding out for the 0-0 draw and damn near getting it too. On the eve of stoppage time, a set-piece goal from Jose Jimenez would give Uruguay a late 1-0 lead and a win that they probably deserved, but it was hard-fought for sure. Incredibly, this was the first time Uruguay won their World Cup opener since all the way back in Mexico 1970. How does that even happen? Going to Rostov-on-Don to play Saudi Arabia, this game was somehow even more boring. Luis Suarez would score a pretty sweaty goal in the 23rd minute, and La Celeste would sit on this lead for the rest of the game and beat the Saudis without breaking a sweat. They had just gotten 5 goals dropped on them by Russia, and I'm sure if Uruguay really went for it here, they could have done the same, but the Saudi defense did look better, and Uruguay really didn't have a reason to go for it. They have a long tournament ahead of them. Having already secured a spot in the knockouts for the 3rd straight World Cup, Uruguay would be playing Russia at Cosmos Stadium in Samara with first place in the group on the line. Suarez would strike first for La Celeste with a free kick from the half circle that beat Akinfeev. Diego Lajalt would score a second for Uruguay when his shot took a massive deflection off Denis Cheryshev, a deflection so big it ended up going down as an own goal. So that's 2-0 after 23 minutes. After Cavani picked up a rebound goal to death to finish off the scoring at 3-0, Uruguay had rather effortlessly won Group A, and we're moving on to the round of 16 for a date with Portugal. Ronaldo versus Suarez in Sochi, the headlines write themselves. I was so hyped for this game, and I was rooting for Uruguay in this one. It's Messi over Ronaldo forever. Plus, Portugal needed some karma after their fraudulent run at the Euros in 2016. Cavani would make me happy immediately on a header, sending off the brilliant crossing assist from Suarez, and man, these two were just something special playing together. It's rare for a country like Uruguay to have two strikers this good that can play off each other and take the pressure off one another. It's just a thing of beauty. Uruguay would take that lead into halftime, but off a corner, Pepe's ancient fucking ass would head past Fernando Muslera to equalize for the Lusitanians. This lasted only a few minutes, where Cavani would score a way better goal on a brilliantly curled shot. Portugal had one foot in the grave, and after some dogged defending from Uruguay at the end of the game, it was over for the European champions. Uruguay had won, they were moving on to the quarterfinals. I may have been Uruguay's biggest cheerleader up to this point, but when they met France in Nizhny Novgorod, I knew it was Jover. This was the best team in the world, and they would prove it in this game that they were a different class. The first half was cagey as fuck, but a free kick would be headed home by Rafael Varane before the first half ended to give the Blue the 1-0 lead. Hugo Lloris made a great save to keep the game at 1-0, and then Muslera would have a howler in goal off an ordinary long shot from Antoine Griezmann to give France an extremely cheap 2-0 lead. At this point, it was over. Les Bleus would stamp their ticket to the semis, and Uruguay's last run with Prime Suarez and Prime Cavani and Prime Godin was done. Qualifying for Qatar 2022 was marred by COVID, and it saw a long winless streak that saw La Celeste fall from being among the frontrunners to sitting in 6th place. Fully out of the World Cup with 4 games to go. A win in Asuncion and a win at home against Bolivia helped a lot, but a third straight win at home against Peru locked up an automatic ticket to the World Cup, rescuing an uneven campaign. In Qatar, the Uruguayans would be drawn in a tough group again, one full of grudge matches. Portugal would get their chance at revenge for Russia, Ghana is here looking for revenge for South Africa, and South Korea is here. Uruguay knocked them out of South Africa as well, but way less people remember that. Even without all that nonsense, Uruguay was done no favors with this group draw, but I remember being really pessimistic about Uruguay's chances in getting out of this group. Game 1 in Al Ryan was against South Korea, and Jesus Christ. La Celeste had more of the opportunities in this one, but they didn't put any of them away. Diego Godin hit the post, Federico Valverde hit the post, but no one hit the back of the net on either team, and the game would end 0-0. This was not a great result for Uruguay, who probably needed a result against Portugal and a win against Ghana to feel comfortable about going to the knockouts. Lusail saw another round of Ronaldo versus Suarez, with the boys in red looking for revenge for the last World Cup. The first half finished scoreless, and once again Uruguay just looked completely uninspired on offense despite having Suarez and Cavani and a young Darwin Nunez and other quality players. They would pay for it too, and Bruno Fernandes sort of accidentally scored trying to get it to Ronaldo. Portugal would hold this 1-0 lead until stoppage time when a penalty allowed Fernandes to get himself a brace and end the game 2-0. This was an awful loss for Uruguay to take, as they now sat in last place going into match day 3 and they needed to beat Ghana and get help. This game is a bit depressing. It's Ghana trying to get revenge for the hand of God too, and funny enough, this game started with Ghana winning a penalty on a foul in the box by Uruguay and goalie Sergio Rocher, but then Big Rocher would save the ensuing penalty taken by Andre Ayew. You just can't script this. A few minutes later, Georgian de Arrascaeta scored not 1 but 2 goals to send Uruguayan fans into delirium, because at 2-0 up, they were going through to the knockouts. They would hold this lead all the way until the final whistle to deny Ghana their revenge, but unfortunately for Uruguay, Portugal blew it in the other game. South Korea had pipped second place on goals scored. La Celeste just needed to score 1 more goal, and they would feel like they should have had it on one of a few penalty shots in the second half of the game, but they didn't get any of them. For the first time since 2002, Uruguay had been grouped. We catch up to the current day with Uruguay transitioning into a new era, one that's still bright and one that looks to have ended Uruguay's struggles with qualifying once and for all. South America now gets 6 automatic tickets to the dance, along with 7th place getting a spot at the good old Intercontinental Playoffs. This meant Uruguay should never struggle to reach the World Cup again unless they're in a seriously serious dark age, and they certainly wouldn't struggle for North America 2026. This wasn't effortless by any means. La Celeste would finish 4th place in the middle of a 4-way tie between 3rd through 6th, but that was safely ahead of the bottom 4. In North America, Uruguay has found themselves in an interesting group. They get a rematch with Spain, making this the only group with more than one World Cup winner in it. They also get a rematch with Saudi Arabia, who's looking for revenge for what happened in Russia, and then Cape Verde is here making their debut out of Africa. As far as group draws go for the 48-team Arab, this isn't a bad one, because there's no reason Uruguay can't pick up 4 points here and go through no matter what. They really should get second place, but the fact that Spain is here, arguably the best team in the world currently, that does cap their ceiling a little bit here. Still, they just gotta reach the knockouts. Who knows what happens from there. Thank you all so much for watching video number 30 out of 48. It's going to be a race to get the rest of these done in time for the World Cup, but I hope you all enjoyed this one. Uruguay is one of the classic World Cup underdogs. They've had a few great runs and some controversial ones recently, but their history is fascinating. Tomorrow we'll talk about Saudi Arabia, another controversial team with less great runs, but some worth talking about nonetheless. You might be surprised by how many of these the Saudis have participated in.